Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives. Jobs, incomes, debts, our own, those of our children, those in the larger society we live in. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life, and I hope that has prepared me well to present these weekly updates to get an idea of what's going on in the economy around us. I begin one more time with the Uber Corporation. I talk about them because it's important to understand that the so-called gig economy or the so-called startup economy has another side to it which their publicity hides, but which it's important to understand. First, the stark facts that were recently released. A year ago, 2016, hackers broke into the Uber system and thereby got all kinds of information, credit card numbers, addresses, all of that, of, get this, 57 million Uber customers and drivers. A year ago. We learned about it over a year later. It was hidden by the Uber company, they knew all about it, for a year. But the news gets worse. A ransom was demanded by the hackers in order not to use and go public with what they had achieved. And the Uber Corporation paid them $100,000, good deal for the hackers, to hide all of this. But as these things will, it came to light. What does this mean? Well, it means that Uber lied to us by not telling us, 57 million of us, that our information had been compromised for a year. Lord knows how many people's lives were messed up in terms of their credit and a whole lot of other things like that over that period of time. A ransom was paid? That's how the corporation handled it? Well, let's see what that means. Here's what it probably means without having the books of the Uber company available. You can't be sure. But it probably means that companies like Uber, which accumulate all kinds of very valuable information, ought to spend a lot of money making sure these private bits of information are secure. Clearly, Uber didn't do that. And maybe Uber calculates, like no doubt other ones of these companies do, that it's cheaper to pay off the hackers $100,000 than to make sure that our information, given freely to Uber, is secure. And this leads to the general conclusion about companies like Uber. Basically, Uber provides taxi rides. That's right. They do the same thing that a taxi company does. You get involved with them, you call them, you hail them, and they take you where you want to go. That's what Uber does. Only this is a difference. Years ago, when taxi rides began, and people discovered that the taxi might not be safe, might not be maintained correctly, might not have the adequate insurance it needs, we discovered that the private taxi company would shave the corners to make more money. And so to protect the public, we instituted commissions. And the commissions made the taxi companies take the necessary precautions. And that, of course, is expensive. So what the commissions did was set the taxi rides at a price that would pay the driver and pay the company enough money to meet the demands of the commissions for our safety. All that Uber is a way around the safety. And thereby they can compete with taxis because they don't have to maintain the safety, they don't have to maintain the vetting of the driver, they don't have to maintain the insurances that a regular taxi company has, so they could make more profits, which they did. And we pay the price. You know how? The drivers aren't as good, the insurance isn't as good, the maintenance isn't as good, and now we discover that the security of our information isn't very good. Taxi companies didn't accumulate that information. We didn't have to be protected. Now we discover, like with taxis, we need a commission to oversee this company because in its drive for profits, it sacrifices the public. And that's a problem with a capitalist system where profit is the bottom line, not serving the customer. That's only the means to get the bottom line up there, and we can see what that means. My next update has to do with sugar. Sugar is a crucial item in the diet of the United States and of many other countries. Sugar producers, that is the capitalist companies that raise, process, package, and all the rest, sugar, have an association, like all industry groups. It's called the Sugar Research Foundation. It turns out, in an article published in the academic or scientific journal PLOS Biology, November 21st of this year, they reported on research of 3 professors at the University of California in San Francisco that back in the 1960s, the Sugar Research Foundation sponsored some scientific research to look into the question, what is the relationship between sugar consumption on the one hand, heart disease, and bladder cancer on the other? And when that research began to suggest to scientists that there was a connection that would be important to let everybody know about, the Sugar Research Foundation abruptly stopped the research, stopped the funding of the research, and so in the intervening half a century, we have been kept in the dark about that potentially crucial research, obviously because it was not in the interest of the sugar businesses to rescue us from what they were doing and making profits. It's another sign of the danger of putting the food production of our society in the hands of companies whose first objective is profits, not the safety or nutritional value of what they produce. My third update today has to do, this will come as a big surprise, with President Donald Trump. I know you perhaps have already heard enough or more than enough about what he's doing, but this is something you may not have heard about. You know, in the past, politicians knew it was appropriate to keep a certain distance between themselves as political office holders and business interests about making money. With Mr. Trump, the notion of keeping a distance has disappeared. And in a way, that's very helpful because you can see what was kind of hidden before, nice and clearly presented to you. So I'm going to go through 5 recent business activities that Mr. Trump has been involved in because I think it's an important part of understanding what the leadership of this country now involves. Number 1. In New York City, there is a Trump Soho Hotel in Lower Manhattan. It is having a hard time. It turns out that New Yorkers and people visiting New York seem not to like to see the Trump name on the hotel, and so they haven't been going there. Occupancy rates are poor, money is not being made, and so a divorce has been arranged between the Trump Organization and that hotel so that it won't be the Trump Hotel anymore, because that's the strategy of how to make this hotel pay. Score 1 against Mr. Trump's financial interest. Here's another part of that story. That hotel is partly a hotel and partly a set of condominium apartments. The condominium owners have together sued the Trump Organization because they claim in order to buy those co-op apartments, they were given figures by the Trump Organization which inflated the amount of money being spent and the number of these apartments that were being sold to create the impression that there was a groundswell of demand for these choice pieces of real estate. Turns out that those numbers weren't accurate, at least that's the claim, of the condo owners living in the same building. But now it gets juicier. Let's turn to the following statistic, which I have to admit, when I first encountered it, was so overwhelmingly I did a double and triple check just to make sure the numbers are right. Mr. Trump has been president for roughly 400 days as we produce this program. Listen to this. On 100 days, out of the 400 he's been president, he visited one or more of his own properties. Let me explain what this means. On a trip to some foreign country, he makes stops along the way, not because he has business to do in terms of being the president. It's because he's got with him an army of press people who will take good pictures of him at this hotel, that golf course, this hotel and golf course. This is publicity that would cost millions if it were paid for, but it's on your dime and my dime because he's traveling in the presidential jet. If he did it once in a blue moon, you'd think it was kind of tasteless. He did it 100 days out of the 400 he's been a president. This is a systematic self-promotion of his business interests. In the month of November 2017, we have a new business on the internet. It's called TrumpStore.com. It sells hats, polos, and other golf gear with the Trump name on it. I want to let that sink in. And now the last one. Republican Party groups have decided it's a good idea to locate their events at the properties owned by the president. So the last one I heard of, and so I decided to bring it to your attention, in early November of this year, at Mar-a-Lago in Florida, the Republican Attorneys General Association of the United States had a dinner with their most important corporate donors. It cost $125,000 per person to attend this event, and it was for a weekend at Mar-a-Lago. So all that money had to be paid to Mr. Trump, who owns the facility. This is a level of mixing politics and business that goes beyond what we've had in the past, and I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions. Before going on to the remaining updates, I want to remind you, we maintain two websites that I want to urge you to visit and make use of. rdwolff with 2fs.com and democracyatwork.info. That's all one word, democracyatwork.info. There's a great deal of material that we load up to these websites every day. It's there to enhance, to elaborate, to extend what we do on this program. It's available to you 24/7, no charge whatsoever. These websites allow you also to communicate with us what you like and don't like about the program, what you'd like to see us do. These websites allow you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, to see what we're doing on YouTube, and so on. It's a resource that we make available to partner with you in making the reach of all that we do even greater than it would be if it was just us alone, rather than in partnership with you. For those of you that are listening to this program, if you would like to see the televised version of the program, please visit us at patreon.com, that's Patreon, patreon.com/economic update for the television version of the program. Returning to our economic updates, I want to talk about what is for me a personal tragedy, because I live in New York City. The tragedy I'm talking about is the subway system. This is a fundamental public service. Millions of people rely upon this institution to get to and from work, to get to and from business, jobs, friends, associates, family members, you name it. It's the way you move around a big city scattered across 5 big boroughs. But the subway system in the largest city in America, the city most visited by folks from other parts of the world, let me tell you about the conditions that it's in. First, daily ridership. 5.7 million people use the subways every day. That is double the number of people who used it 20 years ago. In other words, we have an enormous increase in the need for, the reliance on, the social importance of this mass transportation system. The percentage of weekday trains that reach their destinations on time, 65%. That is the worst performance of any major transit system anywhere in the world, including other cities in the United States. There are many transportation subway systems around the world that have records in the high 90% of on-time performance. There is no excuse, no necessity for this dereliction of service to the public. The amount of money that the MTA, that's the authority that funds the subways, gave to the subways this year is $250 million. In 1990, that's 27 years ago, it gave the authority, in today's dollars, $1 billion. So let me make it clear to you. We've doubled the number of people that use the subway, and we've reduced by 75% the amount of actual purchasing power dollars we've given them. So there's no mystery about why the subways are late. There's no mystery, for those of you that are not familiar with the New York subway system, no mystery about the fact that there are rats, that it is dirty beyond all words, that it is noisy, that the bathrooms are not, you cannot even think about going in there. They're locked anyway because nobody does. On and on and on. What a travesty. And it makes a mockery of efficiency, that word used to describe American capitalism. There's no efficiency here. Millions of hours of work time are lost by people who are stuck on slow trains or don't get to work at all. Where's that accounted for? Nowhere. And here's the reason. Politicians don't spend the money to maintain this subway. And why not? Because if they maintained the subway, they'd have to get the money by raising taxes. They dare not do it to the corporations and the rich because they threaten to support politicians against the ones who might do this, politicians who won't do it. So the politicians in office are afraid to tax corporations and the rich. And likewise, they're afraid to tax the mass of people who already spend too much money on the subway ride, who are already taxed beyond what they can care for and tolerate, and they're afraid of losing their votes. So the way the politicians work in this crazy system is by not taxing the money and therefore saving by not maintaining the quality and the efficiency of the subway system. They hope they can get through 4 years on the commission, go on to a higher political office, and let the declining subway become the next politician's headache. That's not a problem of these individuals. That's a problem of a system that works this way. This is a crazy way to function. It isn't efficient, it isn't appropriate, it isn't fair. Because obviously the people who are not paying the taxes are very different from the people who have to rely on an unstable, unsafe, unsanitary subway system every day of their working lives. I turn next to Britain, not because I'm only interested in speaking to British people about their situation, but I'm doing it because Britain's reaction to the crisis of 2008 is rather close to that of the United States, imposing an austerity on the mass of people, getting a recovery, in quotation marks, mainly for the corporations and the rich, and letting it bypass the mass of people, but focusing in the newspapers owned by corporations and the rich on the recovery they are enjoying, with the little clever maneuver of suggesting everybody is enjoying it when it's not the case. The latest statistics from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which is the Office of Budget Responsibility, the leading official of the British government, indicates that household disposable incomes will fall for an unprecedented 19 straight quarters between 2015 and 2020. In other words, we are now in the middle of the longest sustained decline in the household income of the British working class in the history of the country. That's what's called a recovery that only benefits a few at the expense of the many. This makes it the worst decade in the performance of the British economy, according to the Bloomberg News Service on the 23rd of November. It makes it the worst performance decade in the British economy since 1812, when Napoleon invaded Russia. There's no way that you can do anything other than shake your head about such a performance. The last item I want to talk about is, in a way, profound. It has to do with Norway, a very little country, under 6 million, actually 5.3 million people. In other words, the country of Norway is a much smaller population than, say, the city of New York all by itself. But the country of Norway was lucky in a particular way, and luck has an awful lot to do with the economic story I'm about to tell you. A couple of weeks ago, Norway shook up the world market in gas and oil. Why? Well, to understand this, you have to understand that some decades ago, oil was discovered in Norway and the ocean around Norway. Good luck for Norway. A lot of oil. And what Norway did, understandably, was become rich, wealthy, grow with the revenue from all the oil. But the revenue was so enormous that the Norwegians understood, like other countries in this situation, that eventually the oil would run out. And if they made their entire economic well-being dependent on oil, when the oil ran out, so would their economic well-being. So here's what they did. They established something called a sovereign wealth fund. What that is money set aside, in this case by the country of Norway. Part of the revenue they got from the oil and gas they were lucky enough to be sitting on wouldn't be spent for the ongoing functions of government, wouldn't be given to private enterprises, would be run by the government as a fund to be invested in companies around the world and to generate thereby a growing stream of income from a growing pot of wealth that would sustain the people of Norway long after the oil and gas they had was used up. And that is now in excess of $1 trillion worth of Norway's fund. So what shook up the world? The decision of Norway to sell all of the stocks in oil and gas companies that their sovereign wealth had invested in. Why? Because they think the era of oil and gas is coming to an end. They said so. They don't want to be invested in the shares of oil and gas company as the world's use of oil and gas fades out and we shift to solar energy, to wind energy, to all of the other forms of generating energy that are either going to be cheaper or safer or both. And the Norwegians, even though their economy still depends on oil, were smart enough and careful enough to know, if you pardon the pun, which way the wind is blowing in terms of their investments. Something that other investors in oil and gas everywhere in the world should be thinking about. Something that half the states in the United States, whose incomes are dependent on oil and gas, maybe ought to be thinking about. That's why it shook everybody up. But here's what I want to talk to you about, the absurdity of this. And this is not a critique of Norway. They're doing what this system makes reasonable to do, and I hope you've understood that from my description. 5.3 million people are deciding through their government what to do with trillions of dollars of wealth. Is that democratic? They are a tiny 0.00001% of the world, but they own over almost 2% of the world's stocks of corporations because they happen to be located where there happens to be oil. This is a very strange way of using the resources of this planet. It's like a game of lottery. You happen to get the oil under your country. You can shape how the world works for 100 years, and if you happen not to, you lose. No wonder then the world is riven with conflict and tension and envy and bitterness. This is no way to use the resources of a planet. It ought to have been done in a democratic way with a sharing of resources across populations, so we're all in this together and not at each other with a kind of slavish subordination to private property and the happenstance of geology and geography. What a way to organize a world economy. Everybody on your own, everybody preserving their little piece of the action, their little profit, no matter how chaotic. So a decision by 5.3 million people in Norway will change the prices of oil and gas, the energy we all rely on, for 7 billion people who are the dog, and Norway is the tail. Who's wagging who here? That is an irrational way for capitalism to develop the world economy. And that's the most important part of this remarkable story from Norway. We've come to the end of the first half of Economic Update. I hope you have found that these economic updates shed some light on what is going on, shed some light on where we're headed. And they represent an important kind of economic news, unfortunately not reported on in any way that could and should be the case for an informed public. Stay with us. We will be right back.